All right, we have on with us Keith Wilson, lawyer for Freedom Corp. How are you doing, Keith?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, good. It was a slower day yesterday. I saw, yeah, you guys came in there later during the day of the commission.
Well, we've transitioned now from having the police witnesses, the municipal witnesses, and then the Freedom Convoy folks themselves. And we're now in this almost sidebar dealing with the border protests with Coutts and Windsor. So I think we all expected it to be a little bit slower. We're always working on what we need to do 3 days ahead of time. All the parties are, because we have to disclose all the documents that we're going to be cross-examining on. We get our time allocations for cross. And so even if the day itself seems a little slower, it doesn't mean back at HQ things are very slow.
And so we know we have the Windsor protesters right now. We also have the Coutts protesters. What do you think we can expect to see come out from their testimonies?
Well, I think, I think the events at Coutts and Windsor were resolved prior to Trudeau deciding to invoke the Emergencies Act. And that's what's absolutely critical. The only protest or event that was still occurring in Canada when Trudeau and his cabinet made the decision was the protests in Ottawa, which we were in the process of implementing a de-escalation deal with the mayor. So it's difficult for the government to redeem itself by saying, oh, look at the bad things that were happening at Windsor, look at the bad things that were happening at Coutts, because they were all over. What does happen, though, is because these the RCMP involved in Coutts are a party to this, they had to disclose hundreds, in some instances thousands, and we literally are well over 50,000 documents in terms of pages now. So we data mine through those, and we come across documents, as you saw today, with the CSIS briefing that briefed the cabinet on 3 different instances and basically said, not only should you not be invoking the Emergencies Act, you don't have what it takes, but it's actually a bad idea. And in face of that, our prime minister, who has demonstrated very thin skin and an inability to withstand any kind of criticism, decided to proceed with invoking it to give him the excuse to bring in police with sticks and clubs and tear gas and
don't forget the riot horses. Let's not forget
and the horses to trample Canadians' rights, both physically and legally.
Yeah, no, of course. All right, so we've spoken a little bit about Mayor Dilkin's testimony. We've also spoken about the Windsor Police Services officer's testimony. Let's take a look at clip number 1. Let's take a look at part of Mayor Dilkin's testimony, where he talks about the fact that, in his view, the nature of the protests were unprecedented. Take a look at that.
But it was the nature and sort of the spirit of the protest. It was unlike anything I've ever seen. I've lived my whole life in the city of Windsor. It's unlike anything I've ever seen during that time. And the posture and the language was, it was almost as if folks wanted some sort of brawl on the streets. They were hoping police would engage in that way so they could have some sort of, brawl on the streets, if I can describe it that way.
What do you make of that, Celine?
I mean, I tried not to laugh while I heard it in the media room. Like I did my best, because again, it's the same, painting them as these violent people. I mean, if hot tubs and bouncy castles they emit the atmosphere of brawl-like or bar fight-ish, whatever is synonymous to feeling the tensions in a room or in a place where you would consider it to be so dangerous that you anticipate a brawl, or it just doesn't make sense to me. Again, I was at these places, It's enough said for me. No.
I mean, I don't think the mayor of Windsor, this mayor could be mayor of Ottawa if he thinks that this is a huge protest. I mean, Ottawa would get things as big as this often. Windsor wasn't the place where the convoy was at the end of the day. That was Ottawa. So what are your thoughts on his comments?
Well, I've got 2 thoughts. I mean, the first is, one of the concerns at all times while I was here in Ottawa and the lead volunteers here in Ottawa was about the truckers keeping their cool. You know, Jordan Peterson talked about the truckers keeping their cool. Tucker Carlson talked about the truckers keeping their cool, and so many others. And that was one of the things that really impressed me about the protesters here in Ottawa, is how they were acutely aware that what the Prime Minister and some of the police wanted was exactly that. If they wanted to start a brawl, they would have started a brawl.
For sure they could have.
It took a lot of energy and effort, and it was remarkable, the absence of any form of violence, the low statistics on crime compared to any other gathering of anything close to this scale or even a fraction of it.
For sure.
So that's one point. The other point, though, is, and it's a really important one, and it's this. The reason why these protests occurred, the reason why so many Canadians came out at all these different places was never before in the history of our country did they have governments impose themselves with restrictions on the most basic human rights, fundamental liberties, basic liberties. Never before did Canadians experience playgrounds and outdoor hockey rinks cordoned off with police tape, and teenagers being wrestled to the ground because they had the audacity to be out getting some exercise and playing some hockey. Never before did government think it was a good idea to tell us that we couldn't be with our families at Christmas and at birthdays and at anniversaries and at Thanksgiving, or be at the side of a dying loved one, or help and care for someone after they got discharged from hospital, or travel across the country. I could keep going. We cannot lose sight of how fundamentally far this government and the provincial governments overstepped and overreacted, and the harm that they've done. And that's why we're here in this inquiry, and it's going to keep coming out. I was really pleased with all of the witnesses last week telling their stories and explaining how it had hurt them and their children and their neighbors and their communities. So there should be no surprise by any elected official, whether it's the mayor of Windsor or anyone else, as to why there was an unprecedented protest. It's because there was an unprecedented overreach in the most un-Canadian way imaginable by these governments. And the last holdout was Justin Trudeau. What a lot of people don't remember is the G7 countries did not have a restriction preventing unvaccinated from traveling within their country. They did not do these things. Canada was an anomaly. And it was clearly, and you guys know that I'm also legal counsel to former Premier Brian Feckford on the charter, the travel mandate challenge. So I had the opportunity to cross-examine all of the key government officials. None of them recommended the vaccine mandate. We saw in that case, and we're seeing it yet again, that this is political puppeteering by the Prime Minister and the people around him and in his cabinet to put forward their very cynical political game.
You know, I've got three things to say about what you just said. So first of all, you know, what's ironic is that the reason why the truckers were here is because civil liberties of Canadians, according to them, were infringed. They felt like we didn't have any civil liberties. The government wasn't respecting our charters. And what did Justin Trudeau do to get rid of the protests? Ended infringe on those charter rights even more than by invoking the Emergencies Act. That's extremely ironic to me. Second thing you said, you also mentioned how it was tough to keep cool, to keep the truckers calm during the convoy, to make sure none of them get aggressive. But one person who we saw wasn't able to keep his calm was Glenn McGregor, when Tamara Lich got out of the Ottawa courthouse after her bail hearing, and the judge told her she was allowed to get off jail and visit her family once again. Let's take a look at how Glenn McGregor conducted himself back in July. Let's take a look at that.
Yeah, and you're filming this too, hey? Yeah.
Hey, give her some room, please. Whoa, watch your feet. Get on.
No, that's what I tweeted today because I saw someone retweeted this tweet from back in July from me. I tweeted today, that's CTV's finest, Glenn McGregor. I think there's a reason why he's not in the inquiry. He knows that when he sees the evidence go the wrong way, he won't be able to keep his cool. I think this right here just so unprofessional. And this guy pushed. And there were a protester that was there.
It's not the first time he did it. The first time he did it was actually at the February 3rd press conference right after I'd arrived. And as we were leaving the press conference room and we went into the broader hallway, I was at the back of the group. Tamara was further up with Chris Barber and others. And myself and Danny Bulford were in the last of the group. Just as we were entering a stairwell, Mr. McGregor, who's apparently acquired the nickname Punchy McGregor, and quite aptly so, came in with both sets of elbows and elbowed myself and Mr. Bulford in the chest aggressively in an effort to get in front of us to get up the stairs to go after Tamara. So it's a different style. It kind of reminded me of the old WWF wrestling. Maybe he'd be better to go back and cover that and get in the ring and throw a chair or something. It seems to be about his caliber.
I think he'd be comfortable going in one of those events. That would be his environment. He'd be comfortable going there. I don't think that's the only time as well that he's tried to cause trouble. I think back in February, once again, he tried to get in your guys' hotel room. Go do a quick interview.
I've been pursued by Mr. McGregor into elevators and into rooms. Yes, he's highly motivated.
That's unbelievable.
No, it's just insane. I mean, rewatching that footage, I'm like, you really, it's like, it's a joke to me. I'm like, how can you have the audacity to do something like that? Like, you want to underline what it means to have like microaggressions. Like you see somebody and you're just immediately like so mad that you just physically assault everyone around you. It's hilarious. Like, what is wrong with people? Seriously.
I wonder if Matthew Fleury, the city councillor, would think that's a microaggression. I think you might need to ask him in French. Matthew Fleury, penses-tu que ça c'est une microagression? I think now he understood my question because otherwise I don't think he understands the questions out of the people. But there's another thing as well that she said. One last thing from what she said, and it really struck with me. When the pandemic started, I was doing speed skating. I did professional. I did sports for a long time, not professional. And we were told that we weren't allowed to practice our sport because of the pandemic. Now, I know a lot of people had meltdowns because of it. Now, I know a lot of people that got into depression because they weren't allowed to practice their sport. Yeah. And the most idiotic thing that we saw is that as a speed skating club or as a hockey club, we weren't allowed to practice, train in environment that are safe and secure, but they were allowing 50 to 100 people to go on the ice with their parents just to free skate. That's an incoherent regulation that was imposed by the government.
Well, I'm sorry, but you also can't forget about the case of Mayor Patrick Brown from Brampton, I believe, going and playing hockey with his buddies out in the rink while everyone else was absolutely in a lockdown in their house and was prosecuted if they did anything other. So
no, that's right.
I get you there. Yeah. That was a fantastic bust by Menzies. Yeah.
What I think this all highlights for all of us is that we've probably underestimated and not really appreciated how important being able to pursue your passions, your hobbies, interacting with others is to a normal life.
Yeah.
And when we deprive kids of their opportunity to participate in whether it's, judo or speed skating or skateboarding or 4-H if you're on the prairies or scouts and Girl Guides, it really has an impact. We're social beings. And this myopic single focus that the health authorities had of save every senior citizen at all costs, no matter how great, socially, developmentally, and economically, was an absolute policy failure. And the ripple effect, and you even saw it mentioned in the CSIS document today, is people have fundamentally lost trust in the institutions that they thought were what makes living in Canada a good thing. everywhere from the doctors and the public health officials to the educators to the courts to the police. People never thought the police would use. A lot of people never thought the police would use this level of violence on unarmed, peaceful protesters. So the good thing about this inquiry is it's forcing some of these things to come back into the discussion.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, the legacy media is barely covering it all. They're just trying to keep their paymaster happy and meet payroll, which is unfortunate. And thank goodness for guys like you.
Well, I think that's the reason why the convoy was so big, is that people were fed up with these incoherent and authoritarian policies, unjustified policies that were implemented all in the name of science.
It was a long time coming, for sure. That was a long 2 years.
You got one person. The US was Dr. Fauci. You had one man who was in control of the whole health establishment. You had one person here, Theresa Tam, who was in control of Canadians' life. It's absolutely unbelievable. All right, let's throw to clip number 3, and afterwards we'll go on a little bit more about Justin Trudeau and Doug Ford, because we saw some comments and some decisions that were taken in relation to both these men today.
Would it be fair to say that the two parts of this conversation we saw you having with Minister Mendicino, Minister Mendicino was incorrect about whether or not the Chief Mizuno had requested resources, and was also incorrect as to the type of assistance that was offered by CBSA?
I think what happened when I received that message from Minister Mendicino and my response was wrong, I called the chief immediately to make sure I understood what was going on. The chief explained to me that in a conversation that she had had with Commissioner Carrick, that at that precise moment in time, they weren't asking for any more because officers were coming in, and she didn't know how many officers were coming in.
Understood. Okay. And it was also your understanding then that there was a plan in place as early as February 10th to dismantle this protest. Is that correct?
Well, I knew that officers were coming in. I did not know. The chief could not tell me how many officers were coming in, nor was I aware of how long it would take to resolve the issue.
What'd you make of that, William?
Well, I was about to ask you, I think all of the comments that were made today were pretty interesting. When you look at the relation between the city and the police, I think, as we saw from the beginning, from all the testimonies, there were some issues when it comes to coordinating both the departments.
I think that's an understatement, that there were some issues, especially when they gather most of their, not today. It's been a long day. I guess when you gather majority of your intelligence from mainstream media reports, you could be discredited with what you say going after the fact that both the OPS, OPP that were stationed in Ottawa all revealed that they were severely overwhelmed by the amount of protesters that actually showed up. And obviously it was the same at Windsor. And I'm going to go on a limb here and say that once it gets to Coutts, we're going to find that it's the same thing. Because again, when you listen to mainstream media, you're bound to get some disinformation. So I'm not shocked. I'm not surprised. What do you think, Keith?
Well, it's more of a pattern, that the level of disorganization, the level of confusion has been remarkable at all levels. I think this has also been a process of revealing how incompetent our governments really are.
Imagine if this was a real threat. Right? If this had been an actual threat and this is how it was dealt with when it was actually very peaceful, I'm very afraid. It's bad to say, but it actually worries me living in this country and thinking if it was an actual threat, this is how my government would have handled it. It's ridiculous. It's an embarrassment.
I think that they had the tools and they had the capacities to handle it well.
Yes, for sure.
I think if we didn't have Justin Trudeau as a prime minister and a corrupt, scandal-plagued Liberal cabinet running our countries, I think they would have been able to listen to the OPP and tell. I think they would have been able to open their eyes and say, yeah, let's negotiate with these truckers. There's more than 1,000 of them that came to Ottawa. There must be a reason why they're here. I think if we didn't have an incompetent government in power right now, this would have been dealt a lot better than it was dealt with right now.
Well, yeah, because it's an understatement. Think even farther back than that. None of the draconian and unscientific COVID mandates would have been put into place provincially, federally, or through the municipalities. So it goes so far back. It's
Yeah, we
very,
probably would have needed a freedom convoy.
no, like this
Yeah.
wouldn't be happening. I guess it's kind of like, all hypothetical at this point, but it's
That's
a
right.
interesting line of thought. I do sometimes get myself lost in.
I think what it shows too is that very early on in the Ottawa protests, there were senior officials saying, bring in an intermediary, bring in a mediator,
Right.
bring in a negotiator. Let's open up a line of communication and dialogue. And that's the Canadian way of doing things. I mean, you guys are too young to remember this, but Canada was once famous for having our blue hat military, which was the peacekeepers, right? They would wear blue helmets, not blue hats, and blue bulletproof vests, and they would go to conflict zones and they would go between the parties who were warring and killing one another, and try and facilitate a peaceful process. That used to be one of the things that Canada stood for. And the bureaucracy and some of the senior officials were calling on that. But at every turn, the prime minister wanted no part of it. I think he was having a temper tantrum in his office and screaming at people and throwing things. There's probably a reason whenever you see a picture of his desk, there seems to be nothing on it. They probably got tired of having things thrown at them, so they keep stuff off his desk. But it's clear that the adults in the room were trying to encourage the prime minister and his cabinet to take a Canadian approach, and he opted not. Yeah. And I think we're all going to work to redefine Canada back to the Canada that we all once knew and loved.
100%. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. All right, Doug Ford, we heard that the judge said he didn't have to appear in front of the committee, in front of the commission. What'd you make of that?
Well, I hadn't studied the case law on the limitations on the powers of the federal government to compel and subpoena a sitting provincial politician. But as you may have figured out, that Brendan Miller, our lead barrister on the team, is literally a walking version of legal Wikipedia. And as soon as word came out that this was being challenged by Doug Ford, Brendan turned to us, our legal team, and said, Ford's going to win. And the reason he said Ford was going to win is that they even cited the case off the top of his head. Is people probably don't notice this. Most of the time when he objects, he always cites a case right on point, off the top of his head when he's objecting. But the case law says that the federal government cannot compel a sitting provincial member of parliament or member of a legislative assembly to a federal inquiry. They relied on that provision. So I'm not terribly surprised. But, you don't have to refuse. In other words, the law doesn't say that the premier can't come.
Yes, exactly.
It just says he can't be forced to come. So I don't understand why he would not have wanted to make himself available. Politicians often tell us that they believe in transparency and openness. And showing up at a designated time at a public inquiry and being asked some questions and providing some truthful answers is a really good kind of hallmark of transparency and openness. So
I think you said
Ford opted not to take that route, and I guess we'll never know why.
You said it perfectly yourself. They tell us that they care about transparency. Well, Catherine McKenney told us that she cared about transparency while running away from my questions and not being able to state a clear position on whether or not she believes freedom of speech is an important value in our society. She's part of our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and she wasn't able to state to the public a clear position on her views of freedom of speech. I think it shows cowardness from Ford, but I don't think it's surprising. I think it's in line with everything he's been doing for the past years. Right, we have you on for only a few minutes now. If you could just tell us quickly what you thought Ford could bring to the inquiry, why you thought it would be important for him to come on. And then afterwards, I think we have a chat for you and we'll let you go.
Sure. Well, I mean, the provincial government played an important role, partly because of the role of the OPP, but more importantly, why is it that Ford decided to declare their provincial emergency? What resources was he planning to make available for the government to use? And what communications did he have with the prime minister at the critical times?
Yeah.
So what did the prime minister know and when did he know it? So these are all important things that could have come out if he had chosen to come forward and be transparent and accessible.
Yeah. It would have been fun to have him on.
Are you kidding? Of course it would have been.
See Doug Ford. All right, I think that we have a chat for Keith Wilson before we let him go. Can we take a look at that? Saw one earlier. All right. Do you want to read it?
Sure. It's
pretty small.
So from Rumbly, I believe, Rumbly, are the Convoy lawyers going to call on the Freedom Doctors as witnesses to show how ridiculous the mandates were?
Okay. There's a few things there.
Yeah.
One of the things that people who are watching this are struggling with, because I can tell by the number of emails and messages I get every day, this is not a trial to adjudicate every aspect of what's happened in our lives in the last 2.5 years. That's why we don't deal with certain issues. Like there were some people upset with me because of some comments that were made about how the propane and fuel were stored at Coventry. It was stored remarkably well. It was like brilliant how they had set up a cage system. It was just perfect.
Yeah.
But whether or not fuel was stored properly or improperly is irrelevant as to whether or not the conditions were present to invoke the Emergencies Act.
Yes, exactly.
So we're not here to adjudicate every aspect. Whether or not the mandates were medically justified, and I don't think they are, and that's the evidence that came out under oath when I cross-examined 16 federal government witnesses in the Peckford Charter Challenge, travel mandate challenge, is irrelevant to whether or not the government was justified in invoking the Emergencies Act and stripping Canadians of their rights. So I know it's frustrating to watch. The law is a very compartmentalized process, and it's focused by design. So this is not the place to adjudicate that. We were hoping to have that very question adjudicated by the federal court in the Peckford case, and we spent so much time and effort and energy in getting there with our own experts and 15,000 pages of evidence until the federal government brought an application to strike that on the basis of mootness. I won't go further. We can talk about that another time. But the final point I was going to make on this is list of witnesses. We originally submitted a list of 23 witnesses that we expanded to 28. Okay. So we get to propose to the commission people we want to testify.
Yeah.
And then the commission decides whether or not they're going to let them testify. So we have to triage on our list because we know we're not going to get all 23. And in fact, this morning, breaking news, or maybe it was this afternoon, we received an email that the commissioner has now ruled that they're not going to allow us to have any more witnesses. Wow. So everyone you've seen from our side, that's it. Okay. So we had some incredible witnesses on the list to testify, to illuminate various aspects like former police officers who had their phones wiretapped by the Ottawa City Police, other people from various ethnic backgrounds who had been brutally beaten by the police and dumped outside of town, and others. And just given the schedule that the inquiry has with its hard close date of the 25th of February or of November, that we can't just say, oh, we want this many more witnesses. We'd like to. We tried. But we knew we were not going to get all 23 and then later 26. But we did get a lot of the key witnesses we wanted in.